it's Amanda the author, and welcome back to my channel. I'm glad you could stop by because today we're talking about something very special and near and dear to my heart. Today we're talking books. Now, it's no surprise, I'm sure, to you that I am an avid reader like most authors, and I inherited this love of reading from my mother, who also incidentally was big into vampires. So I'm assuming I inherited my love of vampire stories from her as well. Also, I inherited this from my father, who was not big on reading but loved to tell stories. And he was a huge encouragement for me when I first started my writing journey. I've read a lot of books in my life, and there are definitely books that I love, books that I hate, books I love to hate, and books that I unfortunately hate to love. However, today we are just talking about books I love, and these are in no particular order, and this is by no means the full entire list of books that I love, but I thought I'd share them with you. A lot of these are written by authors of color, and not all of them are fantasy, though most of them are, because, I mean, it's me. Fantasy's my get down. Also, there are a couple horror in there, just in time for October. We're almost at spooky season, we're almost at fall, almost at Halloween. Halloween is my favorite holiday, so you can look forward to, no doubt, a list of my favorite horror movies, TV shows, and books as we near the best month of the year, which is October. So let me stop blabbing and get into what it is you're actually here for, get into the tea of my favorite books. Okay, so the first book I'm gonna mention, and like I said, this list is in no particular order, is Horror Store by Grady Hendrix. Now, Grady Hendrix is one of my favorite authors. I love his writing style. He mixes a lot of horror elements with humor, and that is definitely something that's inspired me, and I'm sure if you read my work, you can probably tell. Horror Store specifically is essentially about a haunted IKEA store. It's an IKEA. It's a different name in the book, but it's an IKEA. A haunted IKEA, and a group of employees are tasked with finding out what is happening, because the haunting at first is taking place in the form of doo-doo stains on the couches, and management is thinking at first it's a prank. However, the employees who are tasked with staying overnight to try to catch said prankster realize that it's not a prankster, that it is a haunting, and that they are in a lot of trouble, very much in over their heads. One of the things that Hendrix does, which I really enjoy, is he intermixes kind of vignettes of different things in between his chapters. So in Horror Store, as I mentioned, it is like a haunted IKEA. So he mixes and has kind of these manuals for different like furniture pieces, just as IKEA does. And the manual has an image as well as a description of the piece of furniture. However, as you're reading the book, you'll no doubt notice that some of these descriptions become more and more sinister, and these devices become no longer kitchenware or furniture, but things that are more and more sinister, akin to torture devices. This is probably my favorite Grady Hendrix book, even though I've read most of his work, including My Best Friend's Exorcism, We Sold Our Souls, and his recent book, The Final Girl Support Group. His other book, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, is on my list to read. I've heard really good things about it, and it's no surprise because, like I said, I have enjoyed all of Grady Hendrix's books so far. If you're looking for some horror, if you're looking for a haunting, if you're looking for a haunted IKEA and disgruntled employees, then you will no doubt enjoy Horror Store. And if you check that out, check out his other works. And if you like it, let me know in the comments. Now, the second book I recommend is The Beautiful Ones by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. Now, you might recognize her name as the author of Mexican Gothic, and also her new book that just came out, or that's about to come out, Velvet Was the Night. However, The Beautiful Ones is a bit of a departure. It's kind of in a different genre than Mexican Gothic and Velvet Was the Night. It is more romance than fantasy. And at first, when I started reading this as part of a book tour for my Be Too Weird book club that I'm in, I was skeptical because romance is not normally my thing. I like stories that are fantastical and horror that have an element of romance, but like stuff that's romance forward is just generally not my jam. Like, I just normally, no thank you. But I was here for this book, and Moreno Garcia is such a good writer. Her prose is magnificent, and just the way that she's able to describe a scene, tell a story, describe how the characters are feeling, I was so here for it. So The Beautiful Ones is set in about the early 1900s, somewhere in France, and it follows three characters who are in a kind of, like, I'd say, a bit of a love sandwich. There is Nina, who is a young woman who is essentially being presented at what's called a grand season to try to meet a husband. There is Hector, the telekinetic performer who she meets, and as they start to spend time together, Hector goes to Nina's house to court her in the hopes of getting close to Nina's cousin-in-law, who is named Valerie. Valerie was Hector's first love, but she did not marry him and instead married Nina's cousin to save her family and herself from financial ruin. As you can tell, some messiness ensues. There are machinations, there are plots, there are shenanigans, there is a duel. There's also some telekinesis in here, so if you are expecting a lot of fantasy, you will not get it with this book, but you will see the telekinesis aspect of Hector's powers and also Nina's as he kind of starts to teach her how to control her powers. Well, I loved all of the characters. Nina was so beautifully written. She's very innocent and comes into her own voice and her own power, literally and figuratively. Now, Hector is a brooding man who's got this telekinetic power and is somebody who grew up poor and is newly rich. And there's a lot to really like about him. However, my favorite character was Valerie, and you could essentially say she's a villain. She's, like I said, she's plotting, she's scheming, she's trying to figure out how to stop Nina and Hector from their courtship. Low-key, I was here for her chapters because we got to know a little bit more about her and her life, and I did feel a little sorry for her because, like I said, she essentially became the person who had to give up the things that she wanted in order to save her family. And it wasn't fair, but neither are a lot of the things she says and does in this book. If you like beautifully written prose, if you like romance, if you like period pieces, and also if you are a messy person who lives for drama, then you will definitely like The Beautiful Ones. Now, the next book that I really love is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. I first read this book in high school. It was assigned reading, and it is one of the few books that I read in high school that I still really love. And I've read it multiple times. Now, I'm sure if you are a diehard sci-fi fantasy fan that you have read this book or one of Butler's other works, but Parable of the Sower is perhaps my favorite. It follows a teenager named Lauren who is an empath. Essentially, she's able to share other people's feelings and experience what they are feeling. She lives in a world affected by climate change, a growing wealth inequality, indentured servitude is back, and she lives in a gated community just outside of Los Angeles. And the community is breached by a group of outsiders. Lauren and two survivors from her gated community begin to travel north, and as they're traveling, they start to accumulate other people in their group as they try to strive for safety. Now, Butler is considered one of the preeminent names in sci-fi fantasy fiction, and it's no surprise. She's a wonderful writer, and the topics that she deals with in this book specifically are topical. I mean, straight up, they're very similar to the things that we are dealing in terms of climate change, corporate greed, wealth inequality, classism, racism, sexism. All of those things are very close to the best in this book. And reading it again, like I said, I read it in high school, so around 2006. But reading it again now, just like within the last year, it felt too real. I had to kind of put it down a little bit. That's not to say it's not a good book. It is a wonderful book. Butler is a wonderful writer. But it's one of those books where you kind of have to pace yourself a bit if you're reading it. Now, if the things that are happening in the real world can affect you when you're reading a book that is very similar. I highly recommend it, along with Fledgling and some of her other works. Parable of the Sower is a first in the series, but like I said, I highly recommend it. Butler is a wonderful writer, and she definitely inspired me in my writing journey. Now, the next book that I really love is The Diabolic by S.J. Kincaid. Now, I'd probably say my favorite thing when it comes to sci-fi and fantasy is world building, and this book does it very well. Now, this book is set essentially This book is set in space where wealthy families and people have their own space station that they live on, and people do live on planets, but most of the events in this book take place in several different space ships, basically. It follows Nemesis, who is essentially a genetically modified, strong bodyguard that was bought by a rich family to look after their daughter, Sidonia. Nemesis and beings like her are fiercely loyal to the person that they are assigned to protect and will kill everybody else in their way to protect this person. But this person is the one person in the world that they are essentially bonded to and have a real relationship with. However, when Sidonia is summoned to the main court spaceship and is planned to be held as hostage as a result of some of the things that her parents have done, Sidonia's family decide to send Nemesis in Sidonia's stead since they look a little similar. After undergoing some training and kind of a body modification to look a little more like Sidonia, Nemesis is sent in her place as a way to protect the person that she's supposed to protect above all else. Once Nemesis enters into court, however, she ends up discovering her humanity. She ends up meeting other people and realizing she doesn't want to kill everybody. She also helps thwart disaster and figure out exactly who is trying to kill Sidonia. This book has excellent world building, in my opinion. There are a lot of people to keep track of, and Kincaid does very well with keeping track of these characters and keeping them distinct. There are different factions. Like I said, this is set in space, so there's a lot of description of this space age world that these characters are living in, as well as a couple scenes on an actual planet that looks very different from our Earth as we know it. There's also quite a bit of politicking in this book. Like I mentioned, there are factions and there's a mystery, and where there are factions and mystery, there's often a lot of politicking happening. I really enjoy that aspect of it, and people having to play the role of somebody else just to get by. Nemesis is such a wonderful main character because we truly watch her grow from this creature who is just doing her job and really has no other feelings other than loyalty to Sidonia, to becoming more human and even potentially falling in love. If you enjoy stories that are a little more on the sci-fi side and love rooting for a wonderful female protagonist, I highly recommend The Diabolic. I know it is the first in a series. Unfortunately and wildly, I haven't read the other two, but once I do, I might just end up doing a full review of the full series. Now, the next book that I love is The Library of the Dead by T.L. Huchu. Now, I just finished reading this book over the summer since it just came out. However, I really love this book and I completely devoured it. This was another book I read as part of my Be Too Weird book club that I am in, and it was a wonderful ride. It's a first-person narrative, and it is more contemporary urban fantasy. Now, The Library of the Dead is set in the not too distant future, and it follows our main character, Ropa. She's a 14-year-old teen who is a high school dropout, has green hair, and she makes her living as a courier who carries messages to the living from the dead. In this world, ghosts fully exist and everybody knows about them. There are people who can see ghosts and end up taking messages from dead people to the living, usually relatives. Sometimes it's anything as mundane as grandma's chicken recipe. However, when Ropa meets a ghost who is looking for her help to find her missing child, Ropa goes down a rabbit hole of information and tries to solve the mystery of where the missing child is, who took them. And as she starts investigating, she starts to find and realize more and more kids who have gone missing. She ends up linking up with her childhood friend Jomo and meets a new friend named Priya, and together they solve this mystery. She's also introduced to the title of the book, The Library of the Dead, which is a magical library where she is able to get a lot of information and really meet new people and kind of start to explore more of her powers, if you will. Because in addition to being a ghost messenger, Ropa is also somebody who can travel, I guess, astral project, if you will. She's able to travel different planes in her astral form. Like I said, I really love this book. It's told in the first person. That's not normally also my jam, but I really love this book. Ropa is such a wonderful main character, especially because of how just her breadth of knowledge of the things that she reads, the things that she knows, how resolute she is in taking care of her family and in taking care of the people around her and in solving this mystery. Now, like I mentioned, this is first person, but the writing is incredibly descriptive, and Ropa is a wonderful main character to root for. And I think this is the first in a series, and I look forward to reading the other books. If you like stories that are contemporary or urban fantasy with ghosts and quite a bit of humor mixed into a mystery and this fantasy type tale, then I highly recommend The Library of the Dead. Now, my next book I recommend is Seed by Anya Alborn. It's a horror novel that on the surface is simply about a child becoming possessed by a devil or a demon. However, it's so much more than that, and that's one of the reasons why I truly love this book. Seed follows a young family led by Jack, his wife Amy, and their two daughters, Charlie and Abby. One night, the Winter family is driving on a deserted road, headed back to their home in Bijou, Louisiana, and Jack, the father, sees something creepy standing in the middle of the road. He swerves to avoid it, and the family gets into a car wreck. As they're waiting for a tow, his 6-year-old daughter, Charlie, says, "Daddy, I saw it too," meaning the thing standing in the middle of the road. And that sends a chill down Jack's spine for multiple reasons. Not just because the thing is creepy as hell, but because the thing is incredibly familiar to Jack. You see, when Jack was a child, he had been possessed by a demon, and in the here and now, after they've gotten to the car wreck, he realizes that that demon has come back into his life. And as his daughter, Charlie, starts to act stranger and stranger, Jack realizes that the demon has his sights and his claws on Charlie, and Jack tries to figure out a way to save her before it's too late. I really liked this book. I listened to it on audiobook, and I also read the actual physical book, and it's one of my favorites that I always end up going back to when I'm looking for something really creepy. Like I said, if you just read this book or read the description, you would think it's simply about a possession, but it's also about a family and a father trying not to pass down the generational trauma or the childhood trauma that he experienced, and also him struggling to deal with as Charlie becomes more and more affected. Do I say something to my family? Do I reveal the fact that I know what's happening with her? He really struggles with that. We also get more insight into what happened to Jack as a kid and the incident that caused him to essentially live a lot of his life on the run. It's a really good book. I thoroughly enjoy Alborn's writing style. It's very acerbic, it's extremely sharp. She definitely pulls no punches when writing these scenes of possession and upping the creep factor as the book goes on, which is what you want in a story about possession. You want to consistently be feeling unsettled and have that mounting tension. I also liked that she was able to blend a lot of the mundane in this book, and the family is definitely relatable. You know, it's not some rich family or some family living in a fancy Georgetown townhouse like in The Exorcist. This family are, lower middle class. They're struggling to make it, which is why the possession of Charlie feels even more heartbreaking because of everything else that's happening with this family. The bills, the debt, the broken down car, the small tiny house, the just making it kind of vibe before the demon enters the picture definitely makes it more that you root for this family and kind of have your heart break a little bit once you start to realize what happens. Seed is the book that I most enjoyed of Alborn's. However, I've read several of her other books and liked those too, including Within These Walls, which I have on my shelf right here, as well as her book Bird Eater and her short story The Pretty Ones. The next book that I will absolutely rave about always is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. It was one of my favorite reads of last year, and it's quickly become one of my favorite reads of all time. The plot is very intricate, so I will do my best to describe it here, but it essentially follows 4 characters: a bisexual pirate siren named Jala, who is tasked with carrying a man called Serapio to the city of Tova. Serapio is a blind man who has been groomed his whole life to become the embodiment of the crow god to avenge his kin who were massacred centuries ago. There's Okoa, a warrior who is a member of this tribe that Serapio is to avenge, and he's a very matter-of-fact person, very stoic. There's also Naranpa, who is a wholesome, head-in-the-clouds priest who has grand visions for the priesthood and visions of moving the priesthood and some of the old-school rituals into the future, but is met with opposition at every turn. Aside from Jala and Serapio, all four of these characters' lives converge on the day of the solstice, and their lives are changed forever. There is also a sequel coming out, I think next year, called Fever Sun, which I cannot wait for. Now, this is all set in a pre-Columbian era, and the world building is exquisite. There are a lot of different tribes in this book. There are a lot of different rituals and customs that Roanhorse integrated. Pre-Columbian rituals and styles and dress and sayings and things like that, as well as things that she made up and quite a bit of magic. And like I said, I can't say enough good things about this book. It's so wonderful. It's definitely high fantasy for sure. If you are a high fantasy stan, I highly recommend this book. And part of why I love this book is because I got to learn a little bit more about a different world and society that I don't often get to read about, especially in terms of high fantasy. Now, another book that I love is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This book undid me. I laughed, I cried some more, I loathed, I memorized, I ruminated. This book put me through it. It played with my emotions in the best way possible. And it didn't just play with my emotions as a reader. As a writer, both this book and also Black Sun were masterclasses in world building and in character development, and they've definitely inspired me as I am going along my writing journey. So let me stop gushing and tell you what The Poppy War is about if you haven't read it. Now, The Poppy War follows Rin, a poor shop girl who, against all odds, ends up getting into a super exclusive military school called Senegard. While there, she faces a ton of adversity, both for being poor, but also for being darker skinned than the rest of her cohort. However, she ends up learning that she can tap into a power that nobody else has, and that she never had before. Rin, who never knew her actual heritage, learns that she is Spearly, a long-lost tribe of people, and that she's able to channel power from a phoenix god, a god of the Spearly people. And she learns this just in time as well, because the Nakata Empire, where she lives, is invaded by the Federation of Mugen in what is to become the Third Poppy War. Rin and her friends end up on the front line, and Rin has to grapple with the question of how far she's willing to go to save herself, her friends, and her country. This book is extremely wonderful, like I mentioned. However, chapter 21 is an intense chapter, so I would gird your loins if you are planning to read this book, and just be mindful of the fact that it is a little more violent. This book is so wonderful. The world building is great. I am looking forward to reading the rest of the series. There are 2 more books, The Dragon Republic and The Burning God, I believe. And if you haven't read The Poppy War, I highly recommend it. Kuang is an immense talent, and I can't say enough good things about this book. Now, the last book I'll be talking about is The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. This book is more sci-fi than it is fantasy, but it is an incredible novel, and I really cannot, it's another book I can't say enough good things about. It made my year last year, especially the romance that takes place between our main character, Kara, and Del. I mean, my bisexual heart was just a flutter as I read their tale. What is this book about? So it follows Kara, who is a woman who can travel the multiverse. She's a woman who is able to travel to these different worlds and essentially collect data and intelligence on whether there's life in this world, the different flora and fauna, and things like that. Now, Kara was specially chosen to be a multiverse traveler, and that is because in this universe, in this world, everybody has doubles. There is another you, another version of another another version of each person on all of the different worlds that exist. However, for Kara, there are only 8 other versions of her left. So she's able to travel to well over 90% of these different worlds, because the rule is you cannot touch the soil of a world where a double of yours exists, or you're screwed. And so when Kara does just that, things go from 0 to 60 and bad to worse pretty quickly. This book is heavy on the science fiction, on the science of multiverse traveling, on the space aspect of it, but this book also has quite a bit of like a fantastical element in that there's a lot of lore. There's a wonder whether the multiverse traveling that they're able to do is actually science, or if it's a goddess called Niame that is essentially allowing this multiverse travel to happen and guiding them through this like wormhole. And I really loved that touch and that wonderment of it all. The moments where Kara is about to travel are some of my favorite moments in the book, and that might also have something to do with the fact that Dell, who is Kara's handler as she is going on these trips, is involved in those moments. The other iterations of Kara are extremely well written. I mean, they are their own characters unto themselves. It's not a matter of it is Kara, but it isn't. They have their own lives, their own tale, and we get to meet different iterations of some of the other main characters as well. This book is very much a sci-fi fantasy, but there are moments that feel a little kind of dystopian, like Waterworld-y, like Mad Max kind of, especially scenes in the desert. One of the main characters is very much giving wilderness, like New Mexico desert, and I love it. I love the different versions of the characters that she was able to create and the different world building that Johnson was able to do. And the world building on top of world building, because like I said, there are several different worlds that we traverse to as we're following Kara's story, and it is exquisite. If you are a fan of sci-fi, if you're a fan of a wonderful world building, if you are a fan of a will they or won't they romance, like the one between Kara and Dell, then I highly recommend The Space Between Worlds. I think there is going to be a sequel, but I don't have all the tea on it yet. But Johnson is a wonderful writer, and I highly recommend this book. So those are just some of my book recommendations. These are some of my favorite books that I've read, and I truly think that you will love them too. If you've read any of these books, go ahead and let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you have any book recommendations, let me know, because I am always adding to my TBR list, which is very long. Probably will end up being as long as a novel one day, all of these books out here that I cannot wait to read. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so now. I will be posting more reviews. I'll be posting more about my work. Last week I posted about To a Stare with Love and my Which Kind universe. I'll also be posting some marketing tips and publishing tips for indie authors and all things bookish and fantasy. I will be doing a review of a very popular TV show next week, so definitely stay tuned for that. And aside from that, I hope y'all have a great week, and I'll catch y'all later. Bye! Now, as my name suggests, I'm an author, and what am I saying here? Anyway, I've read a lot of books in my life, and there are definitely books I love, books I love to hate, books I just hate, and the employees are walking in the morning finding doo-doo stains on the couches. And just his recent book, The Final Ghost. There's, his book, Southern Book Club Guides, the Southern Book Club, his book, The Southern Book Club, if you're looking for, his other book, A Southern Book Club's in Edinburgh. Now, The Library of the Dead is set in Edinburgh. Now, The Library of the Dead is set in not just because the thing is creepy as heck. Now, this book is definitely messy in a good way, and by that I mean, what am I saying?